This is Isaac Morehouse. Welcome to the podcast where we discuss education, entrepreneurship, big ideas, how to put them into practice in the real world, and above all, how to live free. Today's episode is sponsored by FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, and Praxis, discoverpraxis.com. Who should go to FEE? Who should check out FEE? Well, anyone who likes ideas should go to fee.org because there's all kinds of articles, a few of them penned by yours truly from time to time, articles, resources, books, but the real life-changing component are the in-person events. And if you're between the ages of 14 and 26, you're curious about the world, you're curious to get out and engage with other people who like ideas and want to learn, and you wonder what economics is all about, you want to go beyond just boring charts and graphs and really understand how economic thinking can make you a better entrepreneur, a better creative person, a better person in general, someone who understands and can navigate the world more effectively. Check out fee.org/seminars, fill out an application, let them know you heard about it here on the podcast. Who should check out Praxis? Again, if you're between the ages of 18 and 25 and you want to get out of the classroom and get into the real world, Praxis gives you the opportunity to spend a year working with entrepreneurs, helping them build their businesses, learning how to be an entrepreneur by working with them in the real world. We destroy this separation between education and work, the real world and the classroom. It's all bullcrap. Engage the world. You're working. You're also doing a bunch of self-guided. You have coaches and advisors that are working with you, but they're self-created. You're creating your own goals, challenges, monthly personal development projects. You're building a website, creating an online brand. It is the fastest way to go from where you are now to where you want to be, the kind of life you want to live. Our goal is to help you live free, to help you become fully alive. And we want to give you the skills, confidence, experience, knowledge, and network to do that in just 1 year for a net cost of zero. What you earn during the program covers what you pay. Discoverpraxis.com. Check it out. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am joined by my good friend, Jeff Till. And Jeff is an author, an entrepreneur, a podcaster, and an unschooled dad. And above all that, he's just a very, very interesting guy. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Isaac. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction.
It's almost a little weird doing this over Skype, considering we live, a couple miles apart, but it works easier with the technology I have. So instead of being in the same room as we could be and often are, Jeff, if you want to check him out, his website is 500years.org, and it's a really, really cool website. You can find blog posts there, his book, Rise Above School. You can find links to purchase that. You can find his podcast there, which is phenomenal. And we'll talk about all that stuff in just a little bit. But first, I got to ask you, 500 years, what is the goal of the site and where did the name come from?
The name came from my friend Javi, who is actually, he didn't make it up. I made it up. But he's a cosmologist who's studying the nature of gravity waves, and he's in the LIGO project, which is I think it's a 3-mile tube buried underground, kept in a constant vacuum, that has mirrors hanging, and they shoot a laser at it 16,000 times per second, hoping that it'll wiggle because a pulsar or a neutron star exploded 10,000 years ago. And so when I asked him, what's the practical use for this technology when you finally figure out how gravity works, when will there be a use? And he said, well, probably about 500 years. And I thought, wow, that's kind of a neat idea. And then I started thinking of other problems that have intergenerational timeframes, such as, building a voluntary society, eliminating school, things like that. And that's where I thought 500 years, that sounds cool. Let's talk about problems that have a 500-year timescale.
Well, that's a really I love the concept, and I love sort of the humbling reminder that some of the things we're working on now, as you mentioned, okay, well, how can I be a better parent or let my kids have more freedom and grow up to be sort of peaceful, autonomous, human beings? That it's going to take time for those effects to sort of it's to eventually we have an entirely, let's say, deschooled, unschooled society after many generations. It's a very cool concept. It's humbling, but it's actually kind of surprising with someone who has sort of a libertarian bent to them with an unabashed comfort with self-interest and saying, I want to act on behalf of my own enlightened self-interest, because it tends to imply this sort of like hippy dippy, like think about the future, think about some group of individuals that don't yet exist and defer your own satisfaction for some unknown future. How do you sort of square that desire to, satisfy your own enlightened self-interest with the desire to do something for generations not yet born?
Well, I'm not sure this is the answer to the question, but I'm actually not too concerned with the people 500 years from now, because I'm wildly obsessed with my own obligations, my own personal freedom, how my children are treated, how we act with each other, how we act with friends, how we become virtuous in our lives, how we obtain comfort, how we obtain wealth in the very short term. But I think doing those things and practicing them is probably the path to helping the people 500 years from now, because we're going to be demonstrating what happy, unschooled, unconstrained people who have obligations that they choose, people who are free. It's only by living the lifestyle and serving ourselves now that will actually demonstrate what can happen for the future.
Yeah, there's a something in there that I can really relate to, that is by saying, hey, I'm working on problems that are going to, the ultimate result is going to be 500 years from now, that it is very satisfying in a way. It sort of gives you, there's a psychological benefit by taking the pressure off. You don't suddenly feel this need to like go out there and evangelize and beat everyone over the head and convince them that your arguments are right, when you realize the work you're doing is something on a much longer time horizon. And as you said, if you can live free and your kids can live free, the example they will set, that's going to have a more profound impact than the number of people you can sort of like browbeat into agreeing intellectually with your arguments. It kind of reminds me of one of my favorite essays by Albert J. Nock is called Isaiah's Job. And he talks about, every prophet's job, it's not to preach to the masses. They're preaching to the masses, but the masses aren't really listening and they're not going to change. The message is really for the remnant, and they may never see them or meet them, but those are the people who need it. That's who it's for. And I've never found that discouraging. I've always found that encouraging, because the majority of stuff, that you do, the majority of people don't notice it, right? Like they don't notice it. It's not transforming them. But if you remind yourself, I'm working on something. This is almost like a clandestine, underground resistance movement. Like we're doing something subversive that has an impact on a small number of influential people that sort of builds over time. Does that sort of, I don't know, did you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah. Well, I think it's what's interesting is when I meet up with you, we can have the conversations that sort of extend, the practice and the theory further in pretty unique ways, since we have pretty broad agreement and both have deep knowledge. The effect on my children is going to be that they're going to grow up with this being their state of nature, which is kind of really interesting, because I had to spend a long time both sort of deschooling, deparenting, de-norming. I don't know exactly what the word is, but to get myself out of, into this new mode. Now, random people I meet, like my neighbors, from anything from telling them that my wife doesn't work, that I only work part-time, that my kids don't go to school, they just think they think it's wholesale craziness for the most part. It doesn't even make sense. They don't even know the right questions to ask.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the script is, they look at their script and there's nothing on there. Like, okay, is your kid in swim club? What grade are they in? And you can't answer any of those. And it's like, where do I go?
Yeah, no, exactly right. So I don't know if that's like that provides in my fantasy world, I'd love to think that they then turn around, go home and go, oh, I wish I didn't have to go to work. And I
Let
wish
me go home and think about my life.
and I wish I didn't sign up for all this garbage, to occupy my time. And I wish I didn't delegate the raising of my kids, to the government.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so
Um,
let's start with let's get into your origin. Let's get into your sort of own growing up and schooling experience and what sort of led you to where you are now. So you grew up going to school, public school, like most children. Is there
mhm.
anything that you remember when you were young in your childhood, pre-college? Do you remember, like, what was the educational experience like for you, and were you aware of shortcomings at the time?
Yeah, I think I was. I didn't ever question. No one presented the opportunity to say, like, should you drop out or should you homeschool or is this the right thing to do? It was totally automatic. I went. I didn't enjoy any academics. I never did a stitch of homework. Um, I have my academic GPA leaving high school was a D minus. And luckily
Is
I was
that passing? Can you graduate with that?
yeah, well, that's my academics. That's my math and science and English.
Okay.
I was also tremendously creative, so I was loaded up on art classes, the theater classes, music classes, stuff like that, and was very productive. I actually used to go to school for about 10 hours a day because between getting there early to meet friends and then being in the theater club and stuff like that. And then I would work late into the night on either my artwork or my music. So I produced a lot. I was very good at taking tests. So that sort of offset not doing homework. But I knew all the math I was learning. I wasn't retaining. I never wanted to read any of the books that they recommended, even though I ended up reading all of those books in my 20s when I did decide I was interested in reading them. And didn't like many of my teachers. So at the same time, my dad instilled a certain amount of panic in me. He really wanted me to go to college to become an accountant, whereas I didn't want to go to college initially. And then the only way I ended up was by taking the easiest degree I possibly could, which was acting and watercolor painting.
So,
But he was totally terrified, of course, that I was going to turn into a jobless loser. And being, which sounds reasonable because acting and watercolor painting aren't notoriously lucrative careers.
um, so when you made the decision to go to college, did you see it as, I want to assess where I want to go in life and assess what I might need to do to get there? College seems like the necessary best step, or was it just, did you even see it as a choice?
No, it wasn't. I was only 17 when I graduated, and I was trying to convince my mother that I would join a rock band in Detroit and do that for a couple of years. And she said they're not even going to take you seriously. They're not even going to let you into the nightclub, which is probably true. And so she started applying to colleges for me. So she wrote all my essays and filled out the applications.
So your mom got accepted to college.
Yeah, pretty much. And Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo.
Which oddly enough is also where I went to school many years later. Very odd coincidence.
Yeah, that was pretty much the only place that would take me. So like my U of M and MSU applications failed. And then I don't know if I did it purposely, but I chose that major, knowing that would be the only thing that would help me show up, is if it was sort of fun and easy.
So what was a college experience like? You were, I know you were in a lot of different bands, you were performing a lot of music, doing a lot of art. So that social side of it, it sounds like it was a fun experience for you from what I know. But the experience as a whole, what do you feel like you gained? And what do you feel like maybe you could have gained more if you sort of knew what you were doing or had the wisdom that you now have?
Yeah. So again, I was pretty productive outside of the confines of the school experience itself, the college experience. So we released 2 albums during that time. I was with 2 bands. We were pretty notorious and had a good draw around town. There was a huge scene back then in Kalamazoo. There's about 117 bands in a 70,000 person town. But since it was still kind of a small town, all of the lowlife hung out together. So it would integrate into whether it was like you were a poet or you were a communist or you were in a heavy metal band or you were in a punk band or you could have been a drug dealer. In some parts you may have been part of the homosexual scene. Anyone who was sort of this alternative thing sort of intermingled with each other. There was a ton of partying, lots of booze, lots of drugs. And then a lot of creation as well, a lot of competition to create music and to create art. So that part of it was very enjoyable. The whole going to college thing, was essentially for the first 2 years, just an excuse for my parents to cover my living expenses. And then I started working first at a pornography store called the Velvet Touch, where I was manager, and then later at Kinko's copy shop, which is now I think the FedEx stores.
Kinko's FedEx, yeah. Oh man, Kinko's.
And the Kinko's was actually a pretty neat move because it was right during my junior and senior year, or my second, my fourth and fifth year, where the drug use and stuff like that was getting intense with all my friends. But I actually scored the late shift on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I'd work from 8 at night till 8 in the morning, which took me out of the party scene during those key times. So I was my only friend out of maybe seriously 50, 70, 100 kids who finished college reasonably on time, mostly because I was out of the party scene those nights. Wow. And then it also gave me this weird skill set. Making copies was actually considered sort of a skill back then.
Oh man, Kinko's was like a legit professional, it was an important part of the world of commerce.
Yeah, so making copies, and we had computers there. We had the first Windows 3.1
So what year would this have been?
1992 and 1993.
Okay, yep.
Still no internet at this point. AOL online.
You get the CDs
America
in
Online
the mail?
Yeah, would come probably about 3 years later.
Okay.
And that actually gave me a great tool set to find a real job, to put my dad's anxiety at rest. And so as soon as are we done with school?
I was just going to ask you that next. So when you graduated, were you like, crap, now what do I do? What came next?
Yeah, so I was pretty I was a bit scared. I was getting a lot of pressure from my parents. I didn't want to become a meat packer or a cereal manufacturer, which was sort of the prevailing professions in Kalamazoo at the time. So I knew I had to move, and I needed to go to an art center. So it was on my list. I was too chicken to go to New York City, but was thinking San Francisco or Boston. San Francisco was a little bit too far away. So I made the plan to move to Boston, try to recruit some friends to go with me. I did find one guy who we ended up driving his pickup truck out a couple months later. Then I just started prepping, thinking, well, I know I want to be an artist. I want to, be a musician and a painter. And so I have to be in this center. And I also knew that I had to work full time to support myself. So I began to think, like, if I'm going to get a full-time job, I'll get one in the professional sphere where I get to sit in an office and wear a tie and make more money than do what typically artists do, which is, go to work at the coffee shop or the car wash or something like that. So I spent the summer honing my typing skills, which used to be a job back then, word processing.
Maybe today, what the equivalent today might be learning, JavaScript or something, I suppose.
Yeah, WordPress maybe.
Yeah.
So, and that actually turned out to be a pretty decent idea, because I started getting the Boston newspaper back then. Job listings were in the paper. And the job section of the Boston paper was bigger than the entire Detroit Free Press.
Wow.
And even though it was during a recession,
even when the Free Press covered all the fires and house burnings,
yeah, the murder section,
crime section,
yeah. So and then
how long did it take you to learn to type? And is that something you learned in school, or was this totally on your own?
I did learn in school, but I practiced. You needed to submit your word count, your words per minute,
yep,
your WPM. So I had to get that up, and I was just trying to gear myself to an entry level job. which is what I ended up getting. I started in the mailroom of a technology research company, and they
That's
really
like the
didn't.
classic story,
Yeah.
starting in the mailroom, eventually taking over the company.
So the this was personal technology research. They pretty much ignored all of my education. They didn't care about my watercolor painting degree, but they did like my mad copy skills coming
Hey,
from.
this guy, look at his degree. He can decorate the mailroom really well with paintings.
And so I was there for 11 months. I campaigned to get a computer in the mailroom, which they didn't really understand why, but I began teaching myself database programming and eventually automated part of the product there at the company well enough to eliminate 4 full-time jobs.
And was this all a means to making enough money so that you could continue to do your music?
Yeah, absolutely. So during this time, I also began my most ambitious music project called Thing and Nothing, which is an hour-long, 4-person sort of cyber opera, all done with MIDI, but simulates essentially an orchestra. And it's an actual storyline with 4 characters. And it over the course between 93 and 95, I wrote it. And it's quite, it's been called devil music that gives you a headache, but it's enormously complex. It's the most complex thing I've ever composed.
So as you're pouring yourself into your music and you're working as a way to support that, I'm curious what motivated you to not just go and clock in, but to do things like get the computer, automate the system, make improvements for the company. It doesn't seem like you would have had to do that in order to just keep supporting yourself to make your music.
Yeah, that's true. I did want to sort of beat down that expectation that my dad had for me.
Yeah.
The work ethic, the obligation to be productive and be a real worker and to be taken seriously in adult society. So I did always intend to move up. And even if that meant that, 10 years later, I was a junior executive making, much more than the average American and still trying to pursue an artist's career. It turns out to be, I don't think it's a good strategy in hindsight. You probably really, if you want to be an artist, you probably have to go all in and live very poorly instead of giving yourself this sort of release valve that all of a sudden, because eventually I left that job 11 months later because they wouldn't hire, they only offered me a $2,000 raise. So I was going to go from 20,000 to 22, and I really wanted 28. So I then, through the temp network, got placed at A.T. Kearney, which is a very prestigious, still is, management consulting firm, where then I started doing graphics. And there I totally started working 80 and 90 hours a week to the point where they would even like rent a hotel room next to the office so that I could only get cat naps.
Wow. So basically your music was killed by that. Or was it? Did you still have time to be pursuing music?
Yeah, no, I still, even through then, I then wrote my second most ambitious album, The Essential Cubicle Nose Picker, which is another opera of sorts. It's a like sort of a piano and violin piece that sort of has sort of both classical and pop leanings with 2 characters and a pretty intense vocal script, or what do you call it, lyrics. And I don't know how I did it. And then I still, at the same time, I was at A.T. Kearney just completely feasting on the materials they given me, so much that consulting teams would schedule their projects around coming to my office to use my services. And then the larger corporate entity would even fly me to give seminars to other graphic groups.
Did you enjoy the work?
I did, because I was being taken very seriously. I felt like I didn't have permission to partake in the Boston corporate environment.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they were accepting me. And that became even more intense 3 years later when a group splintered off and went to another very prestigious firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers. And they said, well, let's come along, come along, Jeff. We want you as part of the team. And I'm just like, well, make me a consultant. And they were like, well, the requirements are a MBA from Harvard. And I said, well, I can do the work. And they finally took a chance on me and brought me on as a strategy consultant. This would have been in the late 90s.
And so that was with Price Waterhouse then. You were a
Yeah.
consultant for them. And how long were you in that role?
I'm gonna say 3 years, 4 years. And what was kind of amazing is they did manage to sidestep my abysmal background. So the guy who 7 years ago had hair down to his ass, and an earring and eyeliner on, singing punk rock,
Yeah,
with his art
here
degree.
are the albums I made, my watercolor degree, and management experience at the Velvet Touch.
Yeah.
Sounds like a typical Price Waterhouse, consultant.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden now I'm wearing a suit. I'm flying in an airplane, going to meet very senior executives to close multi-million-dollar deals.
Was that stressful?
Yeah, but again, I was really just impressed that I was accepted, that I had permission to participate at that high of a level.
And were you continuing on with the music at that time as well?
Yeah, then trying to think. No, that was pretty much a break from music because I had to travel full time.
Okay.
So I would have to commute from Boston to either Oregon, LA,
And
Florida,
was that
or
a
New
deliberate
Jersey.
choice you made? Like I'm going to be done with the music for a while, or did it just sort of happen? Like were you sad about that?
Oh, it just had to happen because the workload, you can't bring your drum set, and your keyboard to the hotel room across country, and there was just no time. You pretty much the schedule is 7:30 in the morning till usually about 11 or midnight, full time working. Your meals are catered so that you don't leave your desk, and you come back Friday at midnight and just try to medicate yourself with alcohol until you have to leave again on Monday.
Okay, so when there's a couple things that are the case now, and you can tell me about how these happen. So now you have kids. I want to know when the kids came along, and now you run your own company, very, very successful company. You're doing very, very well. How did that transition happen from being a consultant there at Price Waterhouse to launching your own firm? You had kids, and then we'll get in a minute to your move from Boston down to South Carolina as well. But tell me about that transition and what happened to your musical and artistic pursuits in the process.
Sure. My break from Price Waterhouse came. I was on a long project with Disney, where I was commuting from Boston to LA. And this was following a long project where I was commuting to Oregon, where I had to, I was so busy, like I had to propose to my wife over the phone. She had a brother-in-law commit suicide, so I actually had to one time fly out to Oregon on Monday, fly back to Boston on Tuesday, fly back out to Oregon on a Wednesday.
Wow.
And then back again. It's a 12-hour trip each time.
Oh.
Anyway, after this Disney project, I was beginning to like break down and cry on the flight home. And they had this movie called Polly the Parrot, which was sort of like a kid's film, but every time I'd watch it, I'd just start I couldn't control myself emotionally. So I just knew I had to get out. But they have this mythology at Price Waterhouse, where they say you're never going to be anywhere this good again. You're never going to be this respected again. You're never going to have this much support. You're never going to have these kind of opportunities. And they very much sort of indoctrinate you to that idea. So I was very nervous, I was going to be selling the cow for the magic beans type scenario if I quit. I did quit, and then I went to I spent 3 years at some small startup marketing agencies. During my interview with the first one, I said I just don't want to work hard, was my story during the interview. And I still, the CEO of that company I still work for today, and he likes to bring it up, that when I finally explained what not working hard was, I said I'll still come in for 50 to 60 hours, but I just can't live on the plane anymore. And then I realized I wasn't so helpless, and that Price Waterhouse wasn't the only thing in the whole world, like they told me. It turned out that not only was I capable to work at another company, everywhere else was like 10 times easier.
Wow.
It was, it was like playing in the NFL and then, being told you have to go play for the high school team.
So it's like when you're in that bubble, that environment, do you just think that it has this effect where you believe the statuses and okay, well, if you get this next thing, then you'll be junior partner, then you'll be this. And do you like start to overinflate the importance that has in the real world because you're so consumed by the bubble while you're there? I mean, what motivates people if they can have it better at other places? What motivates them to stay in that environment?
Well, I think that mythology is a huge part of it. People do know that the partners can make a lot of money, like maybe $700,000 or $1 million a year. They'll have this tremendous amount of power. They'll be these advisors to the sort of masters of the universe, meaning the senior executives at the large Fortune 500 companies. And they also convince themselves that the content of the work, is something you're never going to find anywhere. So no one ever tells you that there's you can be a big stupid real estate agent or a used car dealer and make more money than that Price Waterhouse partner. But even if they did tell you that, they would say that it wasn't intellectually sophisticated enough to be a real career. So I think that's why. And probably for most people, if you're on that track where you actually did go get your undergrad in accounting and then got your MBA, you're going to be dumped right from academia right into that consulting world and not really know anything different.
Yeah. So you worked for a couple small firms, and then you eventually just started doing independent contracting work, launched your own company doing consulting work for a lot of the same clients you had been working for before. Is that correct?
Yeah, one of the companies had sent me home for 6 months to work without having any work to do, but they continued to pay me. They eventually told me to come back to work, and I'm like, no thanks. And so I joined another company which did the exact same thing, except I was supporting a woman in Japan. So I only had to work with her for about 15 minutes a day, because we would talk at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day. And the work that she gave me was very easy. So I had became accustomed to working at home and by myself. And that project ended, and the company called and said, well, you have to come back to work now. And I just said, well, no, thank you. I didn't even go in to quit. I just on the phone said, I'm not coming in. I guess you can stop paying me now. But what luck would have it, I did have an assignment from my first client for my own business, and that was sort of the birth of it. And I had no trouble getting business whatsoever, because everyone who I had previously worked with at every single job was still eager to work with me.
And so now you have a company, you have 4 or 5 employees, and
yeah, we're a fearsome sixsome now.
Okay.
We're 6 people big. We've probably shipped close to 350 invoices. We are constantly busy. We're looking to grow, and it's been 12 years now.
Wow.
And I've had to put payroll on my Visa card a couple times, but otherwise we've been operationally just fine. Now, my recent focus has been about 2 years ago, I decided to do a big pivot where I was going to be a new version of myself. And that was going to be, I was going to reduce my work week, hopefully down to either half time or quarter time. I was going to move to somewhere warm, and I was going to take my kids out of school. And that was about 2 years ago. I made that shift, and it seemed to have worked out. And
what prompted? Actually, let me ask you one question first before I get to that, because that's a big radical shift, and that's something really I want to dig into a little bit. But where you are now, you've got a very successful company, employees, etc. Is that something you ever envision? I mean, what do you think, like 16-year-old, 20-year-old Jeff? Like, is this something you would have thought, yeah, I want to own my own company. I want to be an entrepreneur. Would that have ever occurred to you?
I don't think so. Although I sort of blame there's so little career exposure to children. They basically know there's cowboy, doctor, teacher. And then all
the things that you really like: astronaut, cowboy, yeah. Professional athlete, the things that they're probably not going to be.
Yeah. And then there's this one guy called businessman, who wears a tie and carries a briefcase, even though that might, be inclusive of, 4 million different job titles.
Yep.
And represent 50%, 80% of the working economy.
Well, and it's amazing how long that, it sounds kind of funny when you describe it, like, okay, that's like something, kindergartners. It's amazing how long that concept persists. I mean, I talk to people even who are in or graduating from college, and it hasn't gotten much more complex in their mind. You say, what are you interested in? What are you looking for? They know basically sales, marketing. They usually don't know what marketing actually is, or
Yeah.
all the different things that could be. And maybe like some hard skills, like, an engineer or something like that. But it's basically sales, marketing, or they'll say management. I want to be in management. I have strengths in leadership. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like everything requires management. Like, are
Hmm.
you talking about managing your
Yeah.
own time? Are you talking about managing your checkbook? Are you talking about managing employees at a business? Are you talking, but you really can't. You can't describe through writing or spoken word, here's what marketing is. You have to engage with it and be around it and see all of the different opportunities, and many of which don't even exist yet or just don't have titles. I mean, most of the people that work for me at Praxis, for example, there's no title that accurately describes or captures what they do or even what industry they're in. You just have to kind of see it and see the opportunity. So that lack of exposure I think, can be really limiting.
Yeah, and now I get so much of it. Like I'm constantly every time we get a new client or a new project, it's like I have to look at my calendar, and at like 4 o'clock today, I'll have to talk to someone who manages a fleet of porta potties, and then tomorrow I'll have to talk to a guy who does analytics for mining safety, and then the next time it's someone who produces cell phones, and here's someone who does uniform leasing. Here's someone who runs those little cafeterias in corporate environments. There's all these different businesses that you wouldn't even think exist. Here's someone who leases construction equipment. And so kids don't see this. Now, I think if I had a time machine or even just got to write a time machine letter to 16-year-old Jeff and say, well, when you're in your 40s, you're going to have you're going to work out of your, relatively nice house. You're only going to work a few hours a week. You're going to make a nice big 6-figure salary. And you're going to mostly oversee people who are drawing pictures and writing stories. I mean, that would have sounded pretty sweet to me.
It's amazing. It's one thing that I like to try to remind young people who are stressing about, and they think they have to pick the one right path. And it's like, whatever you'll be doing in 20 years, it probably doesn't exist yet. And if it does, I probably wouldn't be able to describe it to you in a way that makes sense, or you wouldn't be able to understand it until you sort of get there. Well, so let's talk about this 2 years ago when, you were already running your business, you were living in Boston, your kids were in school, and you had this, as you said, this self-improvement project, this idea to become a different version of yourself. What motivated that? Do you think that was building for a long time? And then what were the immediate steps that you took after this sort of moment?
Yeah, I don't quite remember why I thought they'd all should be changed at the exact same time. But all of a sudden the changes all sort of came up individually, and I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm looking to take like quite a pivot here. And so maybe it is like a whole new direction. And there was a little bit of oh boy, like I don't want to call it fortuitous timing because it involved my mom dying. But it all sort of happened right when my mom was on the cancer trajectory to die. But it was also the same time that we had our house on the market. It was also the same time that I was doing intense research on home education. And so it wasn't a singular vision, but it was like, if I'm going to take a bunch of risk, let's just do it all together and see what happens. Which actually sounds like a terrible plan in hindsight. You should probably just take one risk at a time.
or maybe not. I mean, maybe if you know that you want to take some risks, but you're going to have to fight your own habits, if there's a window where you're more open than normal, maybe that's a good time to try a lot of things at once. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think another thing is when you take these big changes to make yourself sort of obligation free or to endeavor to either make more money or work less or take your kids out of school, is that you're comparatively you look insane compared to normal people. And myself, I think most people would think this as well. I myself wasn't immune to that bias. So when I was looking at what future Jeff would look like, it's like, well, he looks insane. He looks like a crazy person to think that he doesn't have to work like everybody else, that his kids don't have to go to school. that he can live 10 months out of the year in shorts and flip-flops and a t-shirt somewhere beautiful.
I'm trying
by
to
the
push
water.
it to 11 and a half months with the flip-flops. It gets a little cold on the toes. One thing you said, you've said it a few times, the word obligation. And what specifically about a sense of obligation, or maybe where the obligation comes from, whether it's one that you've chosen or one that you've sort of fallen into without thinking about it. How big a role has the concept of trying to free yourself from obligation played in this transformation?
Oh, it's huge. And by the way, this is my next podcast that I'm doing is on this topic. And also I sort of go through that same life path that we just discussed. So it's going to be a bit of repeat for my 30 listeners.
This will be the good warm up for you. So
yeah. So obviously there's extrinsic obligation that we can't avoid, such as dying, having to feed ourselves, having to pay taxes. And so those we either can't worry about or we try to minimize. There's some other perceived obligations that maybe we have to do with the political sphere or with religion, again, that we can't affect at all. So it's almost pointless. It's fun to talk about ending the Federal Reserve or the military industrial complex as being sort of people who are obligating us to pay for them, but we can't really do that. Then there's personal or intrinsic obligation that comes from like an unnatural place, in my opinion. And I think it has a lot to do with schooling. So coming out of college, I had this tremendous obligation to please my dad's aesthetic for what a good job looked like. I had my own obligation to conform to a corporate world and to be invited to and be accepted within the corporate world. When the kids came along, the obligation to send them to school was automatic. It was unthought. So all of these things are like bad obligations that come from inside, but I think they're really probably a product of our schooling for the most part. And then secondly, maybe parenting and then in culture, that we have these automatic things that we have to work a certain many hours a week. We have to conform to the school. We have to do these obligations, and they're really sort of bad for you. And they're really, they can be very frustrating, and they can make you unfree. And it's not until you can step outside and begin saying which of these are the ones that I want, because maybe there's good, when you have children, that's a huge obligation that you're setting yourself up for. When you start a company, you start a podcast, whatever, these are obligations that are sort of intrinsically motivated, but can be very positive.
Yeah.
And so,
no, go ahead.
Yeah. So I just, once I sort of step outside and look at these obligations in sort of a state of ignorance, where you sort of look beyond whatever you've been indoctrinated or trained to believe, then they sort of change in nature, and then you can begin dealing with them.
Yeah. The areas where it's a big challenge for me are not so much the extrinsic obligations, because once you identify those, you can see pretty quickly that okay, let me free myself from these. Now it might be a hard process to do it, but the ones that are chosen, that's where you can sometimes get into a weird place. So for instance, with writing, so I try to blog every day, or the podcasting. I have a podcast episode every week. And once you sort of say, this is a new thing I'm going to do, I'm going to launch a podcast and I'm going to do this weekly, and you're doing it and you're enjoying it, then you get this feedback loop where you'll have people say, oh, I like your podcast, and oh, I like it when you do this. And pretty soon you're taking that feedback and you want to say, oh, good, people like this, I'll do a little more of that. Or, oh, I need to make sure I don't miss a week. It's a really fine line between, I want to make sure I don't miss a week because I know I'm going to be a happier person if I stick to the schedule I've set for myself, and oh no, I've got to do it this week because people are asking, and taking feedback from the market. I mean, especially if you're trying to sell something, if you're in a business, it's especially important, but in saying, what is the market wanting? How can I adapt to that feedback is one thing. It can be valuable information, but it's a really fine line. It's easy to all of a sudden start writing or podcasting for other people, and all the joy is gone from it. And that, and then there's this temptation to be like, well, screw everyone, I'm not doing this for anyone. And then you're one of those people that starts a project and stops it all the time. And it can be, maybe you say it's because you want to be free, but really it's because you're afraid that other people are going to stop liking it, or, oh no, you're branded as this type of guy and now you are interested in something else and you're afraid to publicly shift focus, or it gets really complex. How do you deal with that kind of, where it is something you've chosen, but it starts to quickly slip into something that you're doing for someone else?
Yeah. So that's fascinating, because especially blogging and podcasting require recency to be relevant. In fact, I was just on a call with a client who we're going to redo his website. He's really embarrassed because he started a blog 2 years ago and then only got a couple entries and then stopped. And he was genuinely embarrassed that he didn't keep up with it, and then said he just hates writing so much that he just couldn't bear to do it. And I'm like, well, if we stop calling this a blog, we'll call this perspective. Then it doesn't matter how recent they are or how often they come out. Now, I still have pangs of guilt that I haven't produced music since 2009 or a new painting, after thinking that was my calling, thinking that was such a solid part of my identity.
Do you think that guilt is because you're not being true to yourself, or is it because you're not being true to an old version of yourself that you no longer care about?
Yeah, I think it's the latter.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I won't write something else in the future, that I've forgotten how to write music.
So now as soon as you write music, I'll be like, Jeff, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. You don't have to be that guy.
Yeah, no, I tried writing a song this year and it really came out stinky. It was just absolutely boring. But I'm right now I'm instead of doing music, I'm doing a podcast. I've written a book this year, and I'm raising 3 young children. Which is just sort of a different part. And I think when all my kids get into latency, then my hobbies will shift again.
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Because I was listening to one of your podcasts where you talk about writing every day, and you said it gives you do it before, I think you said you do it before email or breakfast, and it gives you a sense of being productive regardless of how the day turns out. Mm-hmm. And then Jeffrey Tucker on your podcast had the exact same thing. He likes to get up early, write first thing, so he feels productive. Now, is the sense of feeling productive, or the necessity to feel productive, is that an obligation or not? And 2, where does it come from? Is it part of nature, or is it taught to us, or is it somehow, is there some kind of fear of not being productive?
Yeah.
Or is there some kind of joy of being productive? What's your feelings on that?
Yeah, I would say for me, I don't know if I'm willing to say universally, although I might be willing to say on some level humans only find fulfillment if they are overcoming some form of challenge, or progressing based on whatever their own definition is of progress in some way, which implies change and which implies sort of overcoming some kind of challenge. I don't know how far I'm willing to go on that.
Well, do you think it's biological? I mean, like,
yeah, I think a
caveman would have had been productive.
I think it might be hardwired. So actually, I have a blog post called "The Hunt to Meat Ratio," really short one, but it's basically exploring this concept of, there are people who only hunt for the meat. They hunt because they want the meat. They need it to survive, and we're programmed to want to sort of overcome challenges or produce, because if we don't produce, we will quite literally die. But then there's another element where production in and of itself, some people would hunt even if they already had plenty of meat, just for the thrill of it. They enjoy the hunt as like its own activity or challenge. And there's that component, and I think it varies in different people, and I don't think one is morally superior to another by any means. But for me personally, with writing, it's primarily because I want to be a productive person. I want to end every day a slightly better version of myself than I started, and better based on my own definition. The person that I would like to be, that I envision, I want to move a little bit closer towards that every day. And the reason I write every day, it's because it's something completely tangible, within my control, at my current level of skill set. There's nothing that can stop me from at least doing that. So if I do nothing else but that, I've at least improved a tiny bit that day because I made myself do the practice of getting words out onto paper. And so for me, it's more about that than it's because I have other goals. that's why writing becomes valuable to me, because it helps me sort of get into that productivity mode, and it makes me more creative. The more I create, the more ideas I have. I like creating things. That's when I'm happiest. So it's a selfish thing. It's for my own sort of psychic benefit now, as well as getting me towards my longer term goals. But I don't know that I would say like anyone has to, has to seek that. I don't know. What's your take? Because you've written about the work identity problem, which can sometimes tie into this idea a lot of people have that like you have to love your work somehow. And I don't believe that that's true. But what are your thoughts on this drive to be productive?
I don't know. I'm kind of struggling with it, especially after starting the blog and the podcast. And I gave myself a very lenient schedule, which I don't have to follow. It's only up to me. I was just going to get one podcast done per month, shoot for 12 per year.
And now you're wondering if you've all the obligation you work so hard to remove from your life, you're wondering if you're slowly bringing it back in.
Yeah, by setting up an arbitrary schedule.
Yeah.
And an arbitrary task, and I don't always enjoy the process either. So sometimes I'm like, well, F this, I'm gonna go watch the football channel and lay in bed, because I totally can, because I don't have any other, because I already cleared my plate from work and stuff like that. And so there's a while I was, even before I started the blogging and podcasting as a hobby, I sort of felt like I was floating after version, 5, Jeff Tillett 5.0.
Yeah.
Where it's like, wow, I could be there on a Sunday or a Monday afternoon and have absolutely nothing to do. And I over succeeded somehow in removing all these obligations.
So did you feel a little bit aimless, like you needed some new challenge? Yeah. See, and I wonder like if that's personality or if that's just hardwired into every human.
But I would love to be able to guiltlessly drop the feeling that I'm not being productive at given times. And I don't think I've gotten there yet. So I still feel like some of the desire to be productive is either trained or extrinsically motivated or taught.
Yeah, maybe I'll put it this way, because one thing I have worked really hard on the last probably 5 years before I launched Praxis, I was doing essentially sales work. I was doing fundraising, and I got pretty good at it, and I was very autonomous managing my own schedule. So there would be seasons where I was on the road all the time, doing a lot of meetings, working a lot of hours, doing fundraising. And there were seasons where a lot of the donors, like August, December, nobody's really around. There are no meetings to be had. And even, it took me a while to transition my thinking, even though I had not been an hourly employee for many, many years, this hourly mentality that if you're not doing what appears to be work, or doing something that's like somewhat challenging or at least time consuming, or if an outside observer saw you, they would say, oh yeah, he's working. If you're not doing that, at least 50, 60 hours a week, then you are slacking. And I had to transition my mindset, because if you average it out over the year, I was definitely working a lot, but there were seasons where there would be like not hardly anything going on. And I could do more research and prospecting, and I would do some of that, but I had this horrible sense of like guilt, and I had to step back and say, what are my goals in this role? How much money am I bringing in? How much will I bring in this quarter, this year? I'm hitting everything as I should be. I'm producing what I want to be producing and more. So it doesn't matter how I use every minute of time. I had to like free myself from that feeling. If it's attached to a goal, if I know I'm sitting around not doing something, and if I were doing something, it would get me closer to a goal that I have, then I think it's not necessarily a bad itch. But if it's just, I don't even have a goal right now, I just feel like bad for not having one. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's like, then you don't have genuine leisure.
Yeah. So I totally understand it. And the thing is that I don't have an answer for it. That's,
I brought you on here for answers, Jeff.
No, that's sort of, I was even just trying to think of if there could be sort of like obligation management software. Is there an app for that?
Ooh.
That would allow you. It wouldn't be like a to-do list.
Yeah.
Because there obviously those are. There's plenty of those.
It's almost like a prompt with questions, like, what are you doing right now? Why are you doing it? Do you have to? Are you happy? I don't know.
It would have to be like a framework or a tool for assessing both the reasons and the relatively pain pleasure of the obligation, its necessity and its origin. And then it would have to be a second part of the tool, which would help you explain what to do with it. Like, do I figure out how to mitigate this? Do I go ahead and do it? And it almost might cross over into some productivity management type. I don't have a clear vision.
Yeah.
Just sort of the name came out of my mouth
there's
a couple days ago, and I was sort of like, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. But
there's another phenomena that I find interesting that, like, and again, I don't even know if it's a bad thing, but when you start to sort of act entrepreneurially or train yourself to see opportunities and act on them, it changes the way that you enjoy, let's say, hobbies. I mean, imagine if I said, you know what, I've always been interested in cooking. I've never taken the time to do it. I'm going to start to watch some videos, start to teach myself cutting techniques, start to learn to cook. I know myself well enough at this point to know that probably a couple months in, I would already be focusing less on just the act of me cooking as an enjoyable experience and be thinking about the cooking industry and like, oh my gosh, the way that I learned this, what if you could do it this other way? And that's fun. And I love that. But I almost wonder, like, am I incapable of having hobbies at this point? Because I'm always trying to parlay them into some broader, higher level, concept or opportunity or I don't know. It's interesting. And that's where, creativity begets creativity. I like that. But I wonder if it like ruins you forever as just a consumer of something enjoyable. Not that I don't. I watch football. I enjoy it. I spin off theories about whatever new sport I'm going to invent. But in reality, I'm not going to act on that. It's interesting though.
Well, even taking that turn to be a producer of ideas, like I wasn't sure what license I need to be not just a consumer of ideas like the ones we're talking about, but all of a sudden do I have the authority or the permission to be a producer of ideas, which that in itself is kind of can be an intimidating question.
Yeah. Well, so we're going to wrap up here, and we didn't even get to one of the main things that I thought, okay, mostly we're going to talk about unschooling, but we'll explore some of Jeff's stuff as well. We didn't even get to unschooling, you unschooling your children, what that's like. We can do that in another episode, but your book, Rise Above School, is phenomenal, and it has sort of a complete case for home education, as well as some of your own, the things you wrestled with going from schooling your kids to unschooling them, a little bit about what it's like day to day, a lot of great stuff in there, and check out 500years.org for that as well. But today's theme really, it seems like, was about personal freedom, how to be a free person. So taking that as a theme, if I said, Jeff, give me a few thoughts on how to be a free person, what's the most important stuff?
To focus on things that you can actually change, which are all personal. That's probably the shortest way I can say it. Yeah. So that's going to be job, family, school, home,
mindset,
mental
states and difficulties. Like, the day I turned off the news for good. And I used to be able to say, stopped watching the news, but these days I don't know if that many people get their news from the TV anyway, but the day I did that for good was like the beginning of my personal emancipation because all the focus was on things that irritated me that were out of my control. And all of a sudden, when the news is off, you're like, okay, what am I going to occupy my mind with today? It's not being full of things about, politicians saying this or that or shooting somewhere or house fires or whatever, things that I can't control. Now all of a sudden your mind starts to drift towards the things that you can. So that's a great summary. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show. Check out 500years.org. You can find all sorts of great stuff from Jeff there. And hopefully we can get you back on to talk a little bit more in depth about unschooling specifically.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Isaac.
You bet.